And here we go again. Welcome to another Brexit delay. British confidence in their supermarkets is at an all-time low. That's what a survey shows. Concerned about even higher prices, the Tory government is now postponing Brexit controls on EU food for the fifth time. The opposition sees this as a humiliating U-turn by conservative hardliners. That means Britain is postponing Brexit checks on food from the EU once again. Actually planned for October, the first stage of the new border model should not come into force until January 2024, as the government announced now. They acted at the request of the industry, they say. To give stakeholders additional time to prepare for the new checks, revised schedules are in place for further checks. Business representatives welcomed the fact that the decision gives importers more time to prepare. Great Britain imports a large proportion of its food from the EU. The EU has been scrutinizing imports from the UK since January 1st, 2021, when the country left the EU customs union and the single market, as it should be. As the Financial Times recently reported, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, wanted to avoid additional costs in view of the high food inflation and has therefore campaigned for the renewed delay. So Brexit does have an impact on the inflation. The government now said it was aware of the impact of inflation but signaled there would be no further delays. The opposition Liberal Democrats criticized this. This humiliating U-turn is just the latest example of conservative chaos, they say. Rather, the government must repair the broken relationship with Europe and guarantee that consumers will not have to pay even more for groceries, despite the increased bureaucracy to be expected. According to a recent study, the confidence of the British in their supermarkets is currently at an all-time low, as I said, and confidence in the domestic food industry fell in August to its lowest level since February 2013, when horse DNA was found in some frozen beef burgers, according to the latest monthly consumer survey. The Times quoted the survey as saying that less than half of the shoppers surveyed believed that the supermarket sector was acting in the interests of their customers. But with this, Great Britain is again postponing the full introduction of import checks for goods from the European Union by 3 months. As recently as April, the British government announced that it would require health certificates for some animal products, plants, food and feed from Europe from October 31st. The EU, on the other hand, as I said, has already introduced checks on British goods, causing delays and higher costs. The UK exited the EU single market in January 2021, but has postponed the full introduction of border checks several times, over fears of disruption at ports and further fueling inflation. After consulting the economy, the decision was made to postpone it, as the government said, and further requirements such as good checks and security declarations are to be introduced gradually by 2024. The start date for some areas, such as the check of medium-risk animal products and plants, will also be postponed by 3 months. And this should give companies more time to prepare. I mean, how many years do they need? The new model for border checks that has now been published provides for improved use of data and technology. Duplication of work is also to be eliminated in order to reduce the bureaucratic burden on companies when importing goods. These changes are expected to save businesses around £520 million a year in costs. And they published 3 important dates for it now. The first was January 31st in 2024. That's the introduction of health certification on imports of medium-risk animal products, plants, plant products, and high-risk food and feed of non-animal origin from the EU. Then we have April 30th in 2024. That's the introduction of documentary and risk-based identity and physical checks on medium-risk animal products, on plants, plant products, and high-risk food and feed of non-animal origin from the EU. At this point, imports of sanitary and phytosanitary goods from the rest of the world will begin to benefit from the new risk-based model, as they say. And then we have October 31st in 2024. Safety and security declarations for EU imports will come into force on that day. Alongside this, they will introduce a reduced data set for imports. At least they say so. The latest foot dragging demonstrates that Britain is struggling to come to terms with the painful consequences of leaving the European Union in January 2020, which has piled costs on UK businesses and weighed on trade, investment, and ultimately economic growth. Brexit has already contributed to Britain's particularly high inflation by introducing friction into the country's most important trading relationship and hitting the value of the pound, which has made imports more expensive. A recent study by the London School of Economics found that Brexit was responsible for about a third of UK food price inflation since 2019, adding nearly £7 billion to Britain's grocery bill. The UK government is anxious to avoid doing anything that makes matters worse. Tuesday's announcement also highlights long-running concerns that border checks on food imports from the EU, which supplies 28% of the food consumed in Britain, could choke off supplies. Some UK industry groups welcomed the latest delays to the border checks, which they said will add costs and friction to supply chains. These Brexit checks will fuel food price inflation whenever they are brought in, and so the longer they are held off, the better. That was said by Shane Brennan, CEO of the Cold Chain Federation. The association, representing businesses that deliver perishable produce which needs chilled storage, is worried that some smaller EU suppliers may simply stop exporting their products to the United Kingdom in the face of new and costly bureaucracy, and they are quite right of thinking so. But industry groups also urged the government to provide certainty for businesses, which have repeatedly prepared for checks only to see deadlines deferred. Although the delay was the right decision, Brennan said it was yet another blow to the government's credibility, and this confusion at the top would make it even more difficult to ensure EU businesses were ready to abide by the new rules. And Andrew Opie, Director of Food and Sustainability at the British Retail Consortium, that's a trade association, added, "We need to ensure EU exporters who have already seen multiple postponements of UK checks will thoroughly prepare for January and April checks in the belief the controls will be implemented." UK food producers have been subject to full border checks on products heading into EU since January 2021, as I said, when Britain exited the EU's vast internal market and customs union. In turn, checks on EU food coming into the UK were supposed to come into effect at the same time, but were first delayed in the middle of the pandemic. The UK economy remains in a fragile state after COVID-19 was swiftly followed by the twin ills of high inflation and rising interest rates. The UK inflation rate is the highest in the G7, with consumer prices rising 6.8% in July compared with a year ago, and Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has pledged to halve inflation this year to around 5%. In its Tuesday statement, the government said the latest timetable for border checks took into account the small potential impact on inflation and the government's firm commitment to bring the rate down. By its estimates, new checks are expected to add less than 0.2 percentage points to the rate of food inflation over 3 years. Beyond inflation, food supply disruptions remain a lingering concern in the UK, which imports a lot of the food it consumes. The numbers are between the 28% I said earlier and half of it. But earlier this year, major UK supermarkets had to ration some fruit and vegetables after poor weather in key growing regions, and that led to a collapse in imports. A spokesperson for the Food and Drink Federation, which represents UK food manufacturers, said the latest delays to border checks were unfortunate but necessary to ensure that the appropriate infrastructure is in place so that supplies of food and drink from the EU aren't disrupted. In an analysis published earlier this month, the FTF found that the UK-EU trade in food and drink dropped substantially in the first quarter of 2021 and took nearly 2 years to recover. Customs checks of goods from third countries should indeed be seeing a set of procedures that are carried out by customs authorities to ensure that goods imported into a country comply with all applicable laws and regulations. And these checks can include a few things. Custom officers may physically inspect the goods to verify their quantity, description, and value. Or customs officers may also verify the documentation accompanying the goods, such as a customs declaration, invoice, and proof of origin. And customs officers may randomly sample goods for further inspection. And customs officers may use scanners to detect prohibited or restricted goods. And customs officers may also conduct chemical testing of goods to verify their composition. The extent of the custom checks will vary depending on the type of goods being imported, but also the value of the goods and the risk of non-compliance. For example, high-value goods or goods that are subject to import quotas or prohibitions are more likely to be subject to more rigorous checks. The purpose of custom checks is to protect the economy, public health, and national security. By ensuring that goods imported into a country comply with all applicable laws and regulations, customs authorities can help to prevent the smuggling of prohibited goods, the spread of diseases, of course, and indeed the financing of terrorism. And that's why I have some specific example of goods that may be subject to customs checks in general. Customs authorities may check food and agricultural products to ensure that they meet sanitary and phytosanitary standards. Or customs authorities may check pharmaceuticals to ensure that they are genuine and that they meet quality standards. And customs authorities may check weapons and ammunition to prevent their illegal import. And customs authorities may check cultural property to prevent its illegal import or export. And customs authorities may check hazardous materials to ensure that they are properly packaged and also labeled. Yes, I know customs checks can be a time-consuming and expensive process, but they are essential to protecting the interests of the importing country. And there are some dangers of goods from third countries when they are not checked as they should be. There might be the smuggling of prohibited goods. This includes drugs, weapons, and counterfeit goods, and these goods can pose a threat to public health, safety, and of course national security. Or the spread of diseases. This could include foodborne illness and plant pests, and these diseases can harm people and animals and can also damage crops and livestock. And of course, financing of terrorism. This could occur if customs checks fail to detect money or other assets that are being smuggled into a country to support terrorist activities. And even if the British government is not so keen on that anymore, but damage to the environment is another. This could occur if customs checks fail to detect hazardous materials that are being illegally imported, and these materials can pollute the environment and harm people and wildlife. And the loss of jobs, of course. Businesses that rely on imported goods may be forced to close if they cannot get the goods they needed, and this can lead to job losses and economic hardship. In addition to these dangers, there are also other risks associated with not checking goods from third countries as they should be. For example, customs checks can help to ensure that goods meet quality standards and are not defective. They can also help to prevent the import of goods that violate intellectual property rights. Overall, it is important to have effective customs checks in place to protect the public from harm and to ensure that the importing country's interests are protected. And because of this, I even have some specific examples of how unchecked goods from third countries have already caused harm. In 2008, a shipment of counterfeit toothpaste from China was found to contain high levels of mercury. This led to the recall of the toothpaste and the hospitalization of several people. In 2015, a shipment of vegetables from Mexico was found to be contaminated with salmonella. This led to a multi-state outbreak of food poisoning. And in 2016, a shipment of ivory from Africa was seized by customs officials in the United States. The ivory was being illegally imported to fund elephant poaching. And in 2013, a shipment of toys from China was found to contain lead paint. This led to the recall of the toys and the hospitalization of several children. In 2017, a shipment of seafood from Vietnam was found to be contaminated with bacteria. This led to an outbreak of food poisoning in several countries. In 2019, a shipment of electronics from Malaysia was found to contain asbestos. This led to the recall of the electronics and the evacuation of several homes. And in 2020, a shipment of medical supplies from India was found to be counterfeit. This led to the disruption of healthcare services in several countries. In 2021, a shipment of drugs from Mexico was found to be contaminated with fentanyl. This led to an increase in drug overdoses in several countries. And these are just a few examples of the many dangers that can be caused by unchecked goods from third countries. It is important to have strong customs checks in place to prevent these dangers from happening. In addition to the specific examples I have mentioned here, there are also many other ways that unchecked goods from third countries can cause harm. For example, they can introduce new diseases into a country, disrupt the local economy, damage the environment, violate intellectual property rights, fund terrorism, and many other dangers. And it's important to be aware of the potential dangers of unchecked goods from third countries and to take steps to protect yourself and your community. And everybody can do some things, like buying goods from reputable retailers, or inspecting goods carefully before using them, or reporting any suspicious goods to the authorities. By taking these steps, everybody can help to prevent the harm that can be caused by unchecked goods from third countries. But, of course, the main prerequisite is that a country protects its borders by checking third country goods in the first place. And so it is seriously unbelievable that after 2.5 years, they are still postponing checks from 27 third countries. And that's the way it is. Of course, I know the quality standards in the EU, but some people in the EU might just use the current situation to bring stuff from the EU to the UK that does not fulfill the standards of the EU. Nevertheless, we will definitely hear more about this, and I'm quite curious if we talk about in January 2024 about the introduction of those checks in the end. I mean, this is the 5th delay now. Nevertheless, if you want to know more about Brexit or other UK politics, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.